Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer. And this video is a continuance in our series on the Fair Housing Act. Today we're going to talk about love letters. I also refer to these letters as the pick me letter. Because where a love letter comes into contention in a real estate transaction is typically in an active seller's market where a buyer anticipates that they may have competition for seller's home. Competitive offers, buyer wants to give seller some reason to select them as the buyer for this property rather than all of the competing offers. And if there's a concern that the terms of the offer itself are not going to be able to stand out enough on their own, then I'm going to write a letter to this seller, letting this seller know why I am the perfect buyer. Now, before we get any farther on this discussion, let's revisit one issue from the first video in this series. In the very first video, we talked about how every participant in the real estate industry can potentially violate the Fair Housing Act, with one exception. The buyer or the tenant can never violate the Fair Housing Act because they are the primary target for protection under the Fair Housing Act. Buyers and tenants are the reason the Fair Housing Act exists. So buyers and tenants don't violate the Fair Housing Act. When the buyer writes this love letter or the pick me letter, they're not violating the Fair Housing Act. But everything that happens with that letter after the buyer signs it could potentially lead to a Fair Housing Act violation. So buyer submits their offer with their love letter. Listing broker gets it. First question, should listing broker give the letter to their seller? First of all, let's think about the letter. The letter says something along the lines of, Dear seller, we're the perfect buyers for this home because we are a family with 4 children and you have a large home and a playground in the back, and we are members of the Presbyterian Church and we're located near a Presbyterian church, and I understand you were a pastor at the church for the last 30 years. Or maybe it says, Dear seller, we're the perfect buyers for the house because we have no kids. And this is a quiet neighborhood of mostly older residents, and all of your neighbors are going to enjoy having us as neighbors. And whatever the letter says, it includes, a full color glossy photo of the buyer. So there's no mistaking the race, the familial makeup, the heterosexual or homosexual nature of the couple, if that's a distinction. There's no question about who this buyer is based on the photo that's included. Okay, now remember, the buyer hasn't violated the Fair Housing Act. They give that letter to the seller as part of their offer. Listing broker gets the letter. First question, should listing broker give that letter to the seller when the seller considers their offer? Under Washington law, the listing broker has no choice. The listing broker must convey that letter to the seller, because you'll remember that the agency law says, under the minimum duty section, RCW 1886.030, every real estate broker in every single transaction has a duty to make a timely presentation of all written offers and other written communications to or from either party. Listing brokers have no choice. The love letter, the pick me letter, has to go to the seller. Sometimes folks want to say, okay, well, I'm going to give it to them. I'm going to tell them not to read it. I'm going to give the letter to the seller and tell the seller, don't read this letter. Well, that would also be a mistake, because maybe one sentence of the letter, buried deep within the physical characteristics of the buyer, maybe there's one sentence that says, and notwithstanding that we had a bankruptcy 4 months ago, We're so pleased that you're offering seller financing on this transaction so that we can still, in fact, purchase the property. All right, the fact that this buyer's in bankruptcy is information that the seller probably wants to know and could, in fact, be a basis for choosing not to sell to these buyers. So if we had told the seller, don't read this letter, and this letter was the best source of information regarding this buyer's bankruptcy, or at least even the only source, maybe even the only source of information regarding this buyer's bankruptcy until we got farther into the transaction and lost any competing buyers, then it would have been to seller's advantage to see this letter. So listing brokers, you've got to give the letter, and you never tell the seller, don't read the letter. But here's what you do tell the seller. Seller, it is unlikely that there is anything within this letter on which you can base your decision of which buyer to select for the sale of your home. The only documents that your seller can consider are the purchase and sale agreement and a letter from the buyer's lender describing the buyer's financial capacity to purchase the property. Nothing else matters. So let's say your seller gets this love letter. You give it to them because you have to. The seller reads it. The seller has 5 offers. The seller picks one of the buyers. Your job as the seller's listing broker is to document your file showing the business reason that your seller selected the buyer they did. Your seller selected the buyer they chose because maybe it was the highest purchase price. That would be a simple one. But maybe it was because they had the fastest closing date and selling quickly was important to this seller. Or maybe it's because this buyer was willing to put down the most earnest money and that made the seller feel secure in the transaction. Or maybe it was because the buyer had no contingencies in their offer. Whatever the business reason is, it's got to be a reasonable business reason, and you document your file to show that, number 1, that was important to the seller, and number 2, the offer selected by the seller met that requirement. Once again, this has been a long video. There's a lot of really important information for you to understand about the Fair Housing Act. Compliance with the Fair Housing Act is critical by brokers, by every member within the firm. So thank you for, once again, hanging in there with this discussion, this entire video discussion. If you have questions about the Fair Housing Act or any topic, please send an email to me, legalhotline@washingtonrealtors.org. Hope you have a great week, and I'll see you back here for the next in this series on the Fair Housing Act.